Great. Well, welcome everybody. It's really lovely to see many of you here from all around the world. My name's Sam Staddon and I'm hosting this session along with Omar, Saif, who you can see here, and a couple of other colleagues. So I just wanted to just a couple of minutes do an introduction to the session and let you know what the session is about. We have a short pre-recorded presentation already on the POLLEN web pages, but we're really conscious that this is day one of this workshop. We're the first session to have a live discussion. So it may well be that people haven't had a chance yet to look at the POLLEN web pages. So we're just going to give you just a very brief overview of this session, and then I'm going to hand over to Omar, and he's going to introduce us to our speakers that have done pre-recorded presentations for this session today, and then we're going to open it out for a general discussion. So I think you'll hear from us for probably just the first 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time to talk and discuss and think about this kind of issue of cultivating critical reflexivity. So I'm just going to ever so quickly share my screen. Omar, can you just let me know if that's working?
Yeah, that's working well, Sam. Can see it clearly. Thanks,
Omar. So yeah, I'm Sam Staddon and that's Omar Saif, and we're here from the University of Edinburgh in the UK. The two other conveners for this session you can see here on the right of the screen. So Fleur, Nash at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and Timur, Jack-Kadioglu from Fauna and Flora International UK. So Omar, you can maybe talk a little bit about your experiences as well when I hand it over to you, but Omar's doing a PhD in Nepal, looking at conservation there through an embedded ethnography. Fleur has been doing her PhD research in Kenya with, again, an embedded ethnography of conservation practice in Kenya. Timur, he's actually got his viva for his PhD tomorrow, so he can't be joining us now. But his PhD was on marine conservation in the Philippines, and since then he's joined FFI and is working on social equity and rights in FFI. So he's got this interesting practitioner academic hat. And then myself, I started off working in conservation, so I trained in conservation, which is the same as Alejandra, that we'll hear from in a little bit. And I worked in conservation for about 10 years before coming back into academia. And I think just one thing, I spent a couple of years working in Tanzania for conservation work. And at the time it felt very uncomfortable due to sort of the racial histories, the colonial histories, and it was something that I couldn't put my finger on at the time. But now, having kind of studied political ecology and using political ecology, I'm able to kind of articulate in a much better way. And that kind of reflecting on that practice in Tanzania, I think for me was really important in the work that I'm doing now in terms of political ecology and conservation. And that work has taken me to Nepal, working with conservation practitioners and community forestry practitioners, as well as a bit in Scotland. So yeah, Omar can tell you a little bit more about his work when I hand over to him in a minute. So this session is all about cultivating critical reflexivity. So we thought we would just sort of put out a definition, and I know there's many different definitions that we could use, but we like this one. And this defines critical reflexivity as being an embodiment. So a personal and internal and constant consciousness. It is deeply embedded in the process towards a decolonial future and is understood as the ability to reflect, learn, unlearn, and dismantle overt and subtle legacies of oppression in the process of knowledge production and practice. And critical reflexivity should make us hypersensitive to the multiple ways of knowing, being in, and understanding the world. And I think we've got a really great mix in the people that have presented for us in this session that touch on these kind of hypersensitive ways of knowing the world, and this ability to kind of reflect and learn, and these kind of both overt and subtle legacies of oppression. And I guess they play out in conservation in many different ways. I mean, many of us will be familiar with some of these current debates around sort of 30-30, the CBD COP that's coming up, you know, pushes agendas globally for 30% of the world to be set aside as protected areas. And yet at the same time, you know, increasing calls for decolonizing conservation, increasing focus on indigenous and community-led conservation approaches, things here like the work by Resson Kantai-Duff and others talking about subtle racism in conservation. Some of it's not so subtle, but there's these discussions of kind of, you know, these issues of oppression that we need to deal with within conservation that I guess we're interested in within this session. We're also interested in the ways in which as researchers and maybe activist academics, we want to, or we might be able to kind of work and reflect on our own practice and our own positionalities in our own research and how we do our research, and also potentially looking at the work of others as well that are involved in conservation. So there's a lot of work in this field, and we can see Tom and Laura from here, the ICN reflexive turning conservation worker here with us as well. They've worked alongside Omar and Fleur on this issue. We've got a paper due out soon. So there's lots of interesting work kind of in this field that I guess we want to kind of engage in and pick up on. So in terms of kind of maybe some overall guiding questions for this session, and this is what we put out in terms of our call for papers for this session, we were interested in sort of who is or perhaps who should be engaging in critical reflexivity. And we'll see a range of that within the talks that we've got on the speakers that we've got, looking both at individual researchers, but also conservationists. In terms of what can or should be critically reflected on, whether that's our positionalities, maybe our assumptions, our knowledge, but also maybe projects being developed and implemented within conservation as well. Thinking about how critical reflexivity actually takes place, and Benedict talks about that really nicely through embodiment and the importance of emotions, for example. And then thinking about the consequences of critical reflexivity, and I think that's kind of something that's really interesting and we can maybe pick up on through the session, and how critical reflexivity can be cultivated, how we can cultivate that more. We talk about that in the session, in the presentations in a number of different ways. But how can it be cultivated more broadly? How can we get a sort of momentum behind cultivating this critical reflexivity and understanding the work that that does? So these are our pre-recorded presentations, and I don't know how many people here have had the chance to go online and see these, but they're all 15 minutes, super interesting, easy to watch, free to view on the conference web pages. So we have, and we're joined here today as well. So we have a talk by Alejandra Pizarro Choi, who's looking at geopolitical ecology of conservation funding, discourse and power in counter illegal wildlife trade programs in Peru. And she joins us from Peru at the moment. She's in Iquitos in the Amazon, and we're hoping her connections will stay strong. We're joined by Benedict Singleton from Malmö University in Sweden, and his work on clumsy learning towards a pedagogy of reflexivity. And Sayan Banerjee from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore in India, about his own PhD research and becoming an encounter and reflexivity himself. So on the local community and the PhD researcher in human-elephant conflict. So I'm going to stop sharing. There are speakers. And I'm going to hand over to Omar to introduce the speakers, and they're going to just talk to us for a few minutes each. Thanks, Omar.
Thanks, Sam. And we're very pleased today to have all our presenters here, and to our participants too, who we know the work of some and are also friends with some. So looking forward to a really engaged discussion, and hope everyone can really participate and feel that they can. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Omar Saif. I am at the University of Edinburgh, supervised by Dr. Samantha Staddon and Dr. Aidan Keane. As Sam said, I'm working in Nepal now, and working predominantly with conservation staff. And I think maybe just a bit about my approach, positionality, I feel, in terms of kind of trying to work in a decolonial way. Staff, for me, felt a really good approach in terms of trying to soften power hierarchies, as kind of Saif Banerjee kind of discusses in his own papers. I'm really looking forward to conversations with him and how he engaged with that as well. And so just to reintroduce the speakers, and Sam already gave a brief introduction. So Alejandra Pizarro Choi, and if you guys are fine, just to speak in the order that I introduce you. So Alejandra first, Benedict, then Cyan, doctoral researcher at the University of St Andrews, and Alejandra has been working in Peru for some time and has been a practitioner, and now is engaging in deep field work with practitioners, and this kind of double positionality and having multiple hats is something that's really important for reflexivity, and for us thinking about reflexivity of researchers themselves and of practitioners is something that's really interesting to have a conversation between. Benedict Singleton, Associate Professor at Malmö University. It's been really interesting coming from a perspective outside conservation, but really I think it speaks to a lot of the questions of clumsy learning and how we go from being in the field to idiots abroad, which is a great term, to kind of experts and scientists. And then finally, Sayan Banerjee, doctoral researcher at National Institute of Advanced Studies in India. And again, really it's kind of about the reflexivity of the researcher themselves, and I won't go into too much detail, but in kind of shattering these binaries of what conflict and coexistence is, and the encounter between the researcher and the researched is a really great perspective and something I think we can all relate to. So without further ado, we can just get each of you to just speak a bit, 2 to 3 minutes of just a broad overview of your work, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And please, just general housekeeping, if anyone wants to raise their hand using the function, please do that. If you prefer to write a question in the chat, you can do that as well, and then we'll facilitate it that way. So over to you, Alejandra. Thank you and welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Sam and Omar, for having me here in this brilliant session. I hope you can hear me all right. I am in Iquitos in the Amazon, and it is a city well known for its really bad internet connection. So hopefully it's fine. So yes, my research is about the geopolitical ecology of conservation funding. So I am particularly interested in how organizations navigate geopolitical imaginaries and the structures of international funding, and how these affect the way conservation programs are designed and implemented in specific geographies. So for this, right now I'm looking at programs to tackle the illegal wildlife trade in Peru, and how relationships between donors, NGOs, and the Peruvian government shape the action that is taken in specific locations. So this is based, as Sam said, on my own experience working in conservation organizations in Peru and abroad for a number of years. And so I've been chatting with government officials, with NGO professionals, and with one donor representative. And this has kind of allowed me to uncover some challenges, both for the design and implementation of programs, but also for reflexivity within the processes. So something that I have found is that while a lot of conversations about illegal wildlife trade in the world are focusing on security, in Peru, that is also happening, but it is steering away from protected areas, for example, and handling the illegal wildlife trade more at a national level. So it works with national institutions such as the National Police or the National Prosecutor's Office, or supporting law enforcement and strengthening criminalization in a national context, which I found that is really interesting, but at the same time, because it's not specific to certain local contexts, it lacks reflexivity. Everyone's saying, you know, we're just working in laws, and laws are impartial. So that is something that I've been finding quite interesting. And then I have seen that there are some constraints on critical reflexivity from conservation organizations because of funding requirements or priorities set by donors. But also because there are certain things that conservation organizations cannot say or do because they support government, and it depends on what the government also wants to do or what the government requests from them. So, well, again, thanks for having me, and I look forward to any feedback and to our discussion.
Great, thanks, Alejandra. Benedict, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. So yeah, as Sam and Omar pointed out already, the presentation I made doesn't come directly from a conservation standpoint. It's based on a paper that is aimed at anthropologists, but I do hope there is something of use to conservation practitioners as well. Sort of basically to say where I'm coming from in this, like my research experiences around conservation have included analysis of an environmental campaign in the Faroe Islands by the organization Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, my own experiences as an eco-tourist, and sort of a recurrent theme within my research is an interest in the practices of experts and expertise. And this is born of my exposure to biologists at the Swedish Biodiversity Centre, where I worked for a couple of years, and my experiences doing research with the marine mammal scientists of the European Cetacean Society. And my current research project looks at ethical clashes around biodiversity conservation and urban planning. Sort of a running theme through what I do is my research is always field-based in some form, which then means that I'm very familiar with awkward situations, which forces me to reflect on my positionality. And it's awkward situations that really were the inspiration behind the paper that is the basis of my presentation. We had a seminar at my previous workplace at the School of Global Studies at Gothenburg, where a colleague was sort of expressing their discomfort about their position as a white high status person doing research in Mozambique. And we thought it would be, me and some friends thought it would be fun to collect stories about awkward moments in our own research experiences, which originally was going to be a series of blog texts, but then turned into an article. This sort of motivation was to encourage those setting out on research paths that unpleasant things happen to everyone, make people feel that they're not, unique in suffering as such. So we wanted to render visible stuff that is important to the research process, but is often hidden backstage, as it were. So we thus pulled together various embarrassing examples, me and my three co-authors, and tried to describe how they affected our learning, like how an awkward moment led us to be becoming reflexive or engendered reflexive learning, so to speak. And we argue then for a model of reflexivity that is, we draw on the language of Mary Douglas's cultural theory here, that the moment when one's elegant analytical model crumbles when faced with messy reality. And often this is a very emotion moment. So that's why embarrassment and awkwardness are good sort of clues or good tools for fomenting diversity. And we call these clumsy moments sort of things. And we think that making use of clumsy moments is a good way to learn how to be reflexive, but also gives you a clue to something that's going on in messy social reality often. We then conclude with 4 tips about how to try to make use of these awkward moments to promote reflexivity. And these range from sort of the basics, so include uncomfortable knowledge in data collection, write it down, incorporate uncomfortable knowledge in teaching. It may not be fun to be laughed at by your students, but we think there is a pedagogical value in this approach. And also, one needs to be aware that one needs to take one's time to reflect. Reflexivity is not a process that happens immediately, at least it doesn't for me. Maybe others are smarter. But I often find that by reflecting on these moments, I can sort of move forward with my horizon of understanding, as it were. And then our final sort of tip or point is that one should recognize the limits of reflexivity. Alejandra sort of alluded to that, I think, by sort of pointing out that there were some things that could not and cannot be said. And I think this is actually something that's worth reflecting on possibly in our discussion, is that are there times when we don't want to totally destroy our particular preconceptions of whatever? There may be reasons that we hold to things, and that's something that would be interesting to discuss. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Benedict. And finally, Cyan, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. Thank you, Sam. It's a great pleasure to be here at this session. I'm Sayan Banerjee. I'm a doctoral researcher at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, and I'm looking into how people live with wild Asian elephants in their backyard. So I'm currently in my fields, and it is in the state of Assam, which is the northeastern part of India, biodiversity as well as a cultural hotspot. I was always interested. In this paper, at least, I have talked about my own experience and how my preconceptions, then assumptions, then all these things came into interaction with the concepts of the local community, and how those positionalities of both of us interacted. And I was talking about I was always interested in conservation, but not from exactly a species protection point of view, but from understanding conservation as a social process. So as a PhD, I wanted to look into how people live with wildlife, especially Asian elephants, because in India, cause a lot of damages for people. A lot of people get killed, that their crop and houses get damaged. On the other hand, elephants get killed. So going into this place is a kind of what to say, a new experience for me. So I went with this conceptions of I will save the elephants and people's livelihood, and I wrote the PhD proposal like that, and I got grants from 3 organizations and where I promise that my work will be helpful for people as well as elephants. Positionalities as male, urban, high educated researcher coming from a different place into this rural area, which is a background area, kind of backward area. People always kept me at a kind of a pedestal from the beginning, that this guy has come from outside and they will provide a kind of a resource to us, and they will provide a solution to us. Then I understood that whatever data I was getting, I mean, in terms of people's perspective about elephants, the damage, the living, it's all kind of a power process that is going on between both of us. So whatever I was asking, or what the time and space that I was demanding from them, they were happy to oblige. Then all these things, thanks to my supervisor, thanks to my own understanding of reflexivity, came to haunt me. That okay, so what I'm asking about the conflict is a kind of data to me, but it's a kind of a traumatic, a kind of recollection of traumatic events for people, where they talk about really close encounters where one mistake could have taken their lives. So this kind of I was talking about traumatic events. Then, for example, there are poor. The people here are kind of are quite poor, and for them the time is a very valuable asset. So I was asking about 1 or 2 hours from their lives from in a kind of in a working day. So I was able to understand that what I was doing is basically kind of snatching their livelihood on that particular day for 1 or 2 hours. So all these things came to haunt me, and then I changed my strategies. That instead of interviews, I engaged in more participant observation at odd hours as well. I mean, I went to different places to stay with people, to even drive out elephants. So in those cases, I was quite useless because I don't know how to drive out elephants. But people thought that okay, someone, at least he's here, and this guy is useless, but someone is here. So these kinds of, and on the other hand, I was also, as you know, that in our society, women do not speak much to the outsiders, and in rural areas, it's quite conservative. So to break into women's lives more, and to know about their own perceptions. So I started working with the women groups here, the livelihood groups, the self-help groups, and I took the help of a women field assistant, so that women to women talks will be kind of more enriching. So these kinds of strategies I changed, and the outcomes are now quite different. And I think the outcomes are now better for me, data wise, as well as relation with people wise. And I hope I could understand that I could never erase the power structure between me and the people, but I could soften it to some extent. And the important thing is that I could acknowledge those structures and maneuver it to create a kind of a friendlier atmosphere in the research. So that's about my work. I will be happy to answer your questions, and please see my talk in the video that is uploaded in the POLLEN website. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cyan, and to all our speakers again. I mean, we only have 3 presenters, but they're great presentations. If you go online, if you haven't already seen them, and they cover and span a broad geographical space and context, but they definitely speak to the issue of critical reflexivity in more than one way to each other. And I'm very happy to open this to the floor now. If anyone has any questions or comments or need for elaboration, but maybe one just thing I can ask quickly, considering this overlap in terms of methodology, is a question to all our speakers is perhaps how do you record the process of reflexivity that is happening in yourself? I'm sure you might have different approaches to doing it, and it'd be really interesting to hear that. So if you just want to go ahead, maybe whoever wants to speak first can just go. No need for an order.
Well, I would answer that by sort of saying, well, basically the way I record anything in the field, for the most part, to be honest. I mean, I place a great amount of store in my my field diary. I try to be very disciplined in doing that, but then also there's scope for creativity about that. There's all sorts of ways that you can have memory aids. You've got your portable recording device. You can be like, what's his face in Twin Peaks, talking into it, or you can be filming, you can do all sorts of things, I would say, but I wouldn't say I'm a methodological innovator in that regard.
Alejandro.
I could say that okay.
Yeah, Alejandro, please go ahead, then we will follow to you, Cyan.
Thank you. I was just going to say, Agrarian, a lot of my critical reflexivity happened while working. You know, I started working precisely on an illegal trade project in Peru at the same time as the big WW scandal happened. And to me, it was quite surprising to be working at one of the bingo asking people at the office about what they thought about this big scandal, and people being like, I don't know what you're talking about, I haven't heard about that. So that, and everyone was worried about what the next big thing and the next and everything. No one really had any space to think about what was going on in conservation generally, much less on how to kind of think about how these things pertain, or how stereotypes is reinforcing racialization in Peru, for example. So to me, that was a bit harrowing while working in conservation. And well, now what I'm doing is, because I'm having interviews with conservation professionals, with donors, a lot of my questions are like, you know, who dictates the requirements, who dictates the priorities, why are you doing this, like why? And for me, it is kind of like the first moment when they have actually thought about it. they're like, oh, why is that the priority? I don't know. The priorities come the it's a bit strange to see this reflexivity happening at the interviews, and a lot of times people seem like myself that question, which has been interesting for me.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alejandra, as Benedict has confirmed in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, for me, I mean, I started with kind of a semi-structured interview and a little bit of participant observation of certain key activities. But as I said, that slowly I understood that the interview processes are a little bit kind of intrusive into people's lives, their times and spaces, and recollection of these traumatic events are very painful for them, for me as well. So I increased my participant observation, or in general observation of any kinds of activities, rural life, people's daily life, they're tending to different things, and then connected to they're living alongside elephants. So I think that's how I changed my own methodology a bit. Yeah, interviews are there for very focused questions. For example, what do people think about solving this problem? So instead of individual interviews, I went into kind of group interviews. It's not exactly a focus group discussion, but a kind of a group interview where many people will just talk about their own perceptions, but not very in a focused manner. But so these methodologies I developed on the way. I mean, learning on the field. So as Benedict said, that's a clumsy affair. So yeah, obviously it's a kind of a billions of clumsy events happened with me in the field, and I learned from it and tried to build on those learnings.
Thank you, Sayan. Benedict, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just thought, well, now having had time to think about it, I think going back to some of the things in my presentation, I do think when we were writing our article, sort of one of the things that sort of kept coming up, I guess, was it's partly because of the focus, but is the role of emotion actually in this process, or this embodied nature. And so and how when we were trying to think of when we had been, or we felt we'd been reflexive, that often meant some sort of there were these moments which had been in a different emotional register or key. So I guess methodologically the thing to think then is that one has to somehow try to be mindful or whatever of the changing emotional tones. I mean, we do this all automatically as humans in social situations, but I guess the thing to do is to make sure one records it. There's a temptation, at least for me, often when I've made a fool of myself, to try and not think of it again. But actually, it needs to be somehow preserved if I'm going to be able to get back to it, because then you realize that there are, fresher the better, that kind of thing. So I guess that's, to me, is part of the methodological approach to you. And when you are entering a research situation of some sort, you want to be primed to record or pay attention to those things rather than just the intellectual argument, for example.
Thanks, Benedict. Adrian.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. This is a really interesting conversation. Just as was being mentioned around emotion, I think if people are interested, the second workshop that we ran on political ecology and emotions, or emotional talks, in that asynchronous workshop, speaking to exactly this, being present and allowing space to observe, record, and reflect on emotions and affect, and the way that it shapes political ecological encounters and moments and that sort of thing. So that's just pointing to the links with another session. But then personally, I really like the discussions of these sort of awkward moments. Cyan, you just used another term that I can't quite remember it, but it was getting some things going for me. And yeah, the learning is often produced in those kind of uncomfortable moments, and the problem is when they go missed, because they will always shape the research. But to be able to apprehend them, there needs to be some sort of openness, vulnerability almost, and self-reflection. That if that gets missed, the moment is gone, and your research is shaped in ways that you don't understand. But I think a fantastic collection of vignettes would be researchers saying exactly what those awkward moments were for them, you know, and then using that as an entry point to discuss, yeah, issues of emotion and reflexivity. I'd love to read a little, even a book around those sorts of things and methodological insights. Thank you.
That does sound like a great idea going forward, and I think examples are very important in this case because contexts can be so different, so understanding reflectivity in each context will be different to everyone. Don't know if anyone wants to make any comment or any questions, just really broadly opening it up here, and we can keep going back to the chat as well. I think it's starting to fill up as well. Please just go ahead.
There's a question in the chat, Omar, from Anna.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think I can read it out, and this is a question for all. How do you learn critical reflexivity in your field? How were your beginnings in anthropology? Critical reflexivity is a core of methodological training. How does this process of learning look in your case? Yeah, I think that's a great question, and especially since we have practitioners here as well, whose field is not anthropology, that is also a really good and relevant question. All our beginnings are different and diverse. We all congregate around this idea of conservation, this culture of conservation. As Laukik puts it, who's here. Please go ahead, anyone who wants to speak to that.
Well, speaking from my own oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Well, just speaking from my own experiences, when I started doing research as an undergraduate. I was fortunate enough to go to Zambia. And I sort of think of, when I look back at what I was doing then and what I'm doing now, I think that, you know, despite having had lots of training, it was in social anthropology where we were talking about reflexivity. I think I was more too fixated on some aspects of, you know, ethical conduct and behavior. Like, for example, I remember being obsessively, obsessive to get people's consent forms when I was dealing in some cases with quite illiterate people, for example, which with hindsight was a ludicrous idea of what consent was or anything like that. And so I think that that's one of the things that, at least when I reflect on training and when I try to teach students, is I try to sort of say, well, understand the point behind why you do things. And the same thing can be said for reflexivity. It's not necessarily about following set guidelines. And this is something actually I was wondering, I should speak to you about, Cyan, a bit as well, because I liked your reflexivity about your positionality. I sometimes wonder that when the way we're trained in anthropology to do these things is that it sort of ends up being almost like a tick box. You know, this is my class, this is my thing, this is this. And, you know, there's that section in every anthropology PhD thesis where you write about your position or whatever. And that's obviously very important. But then, you know, has anybody ever not done their research because of their position? I don't know, actually.
So for me, I am not from a anthropology background, so I come kind of from an interdisciplinary background, because my institute is a interdisciplinary institute where the coursework is a mix of social as well as natural science methodologies, and in the social science methods, both quant and qual methods. So here, as you know, in the coursework that it might be a 1 day or 2 day affair on ethnography, and then you become an ethnographer. So that's the way our coursework functions. So for us, we could never learn about reflexivity beyond the definition that what reflexivity means, but we don't know how to practice it, or what does reflexivity means in practice. So it's all about talking to your supervisor and other people who are also of the same understanding that we need to be, we need to acknowledge our positionalities in the research, and the research is never value neutral. Science is never value neutral. It's all about kind of interaction of values. So in those interactions in those kind of meetings or interactions with these kinds of supervisors, people, or even with local communities, you understand that the reflexive process. Then you acknowledge and you write it down. And I think my supervisors has encouraged me to write these kinds of clumsy events in my research, and that had helped me, because my friends who are from hardcore conservation background, they also face the same thing, but they never talk about it or write about it in conferences or in papers or in articles or everywhere. But they will discuss it absolutely in one-to-one conversations, that what happened to him or her in an event of interaction with the local village headman. So, but it will never come out in their writings. So I have been encouraged to not to do that, but to acknowledge those kinds of events and how that changed the research process or affected the research process.
Thanks, Sain. Alejandra? And please, anyone else, any participant, please go ahead as well afterwards. Alejandra.
A bit different, because actually, so my undergrad degree was on biology. So I did biology because I wanted to be an ecologist. I wanted to work in conservation. And well, kind of like the more natural sciences are notoriously uncritical about their own positionalities. So the way that we were taught was that you were critical with the data that you took, as in counting animals, but not with the methods you're taking, or like what you're using, or how you're doing these things. So I guess that for me, I was always kind of worried about the impact of conservation actions on the ground. A lot of it was very practical. It's from a practice standpoint. And I guess for me, the big thing was like after the 2019 WWF scandal, it really dawned on me that a lot of the issues around, especially the illegal wildlife trade, poaching, park guards and stuff like that, that was really, really, as a conservation professional, for me, that was like a big point where I was like, oh, well, we have to be a lot more careful with what we're doing. But at the same time, to me, it seemed that in my office and in the sector, most of the people who were managing the project not thinking about that. And then while working, for me, I am Chinese Peruvian. For me, while working on the illegal wildlife trade, like on counter wildlife trafficking projects in Peru, as a Chinese Peruvian, a lot of the discourse is about the Chinese market and about Chinese Peruvians selling to their Chinese families abroad. And I was quite worried because we did a lot of, for example, work to teach police the national police how to deal with the illegal wildlife trade. And to me, it was very concerning that if we were taking these racialized ideas and delivering them to the police, that meant that it would increase criminalization to certain groups of people, which obviously was not the intention. But at the same time, the people who were organizing these workshops or who were organizing these trainings were not thinking about that. They were thinking that about it being, just better training. So to me, kind of like all of these positionalities, trying to get through the points while working in conservation, and at the same time, kind of take an approach now that I am doing research, which is if I am saying or doing or whatever methods I'm taking, how is my own positionality affecting other people's racialized experiences or class experiences? But I guess that is very specific to my own experience in conservation.
Thank you, Alejandra. And I think we can definitely go deeper into that discussion. I see two hands up at the moment. Tom, I think your hand is up, and was it in response to something Alejandra was going to say as well? Then maybe you can go to Anna, and hopefully that flows well.
Yeah, so it was, thanks, Omar. So I suppose it was in relation to something you were saying there, Alejandra, in terms of the extent to which conservation practitioners are or aren't reflexive. I think something that we found in our work was that actually quite a lot of conservation practitioners, even those trained in natural sciences, were reflexive. And in fact, I think reflexivity is something which, when you kind of break it down, if it's really the kind of process of thinking about yourself in relation to your behaviors and actions and outlooks on the world, actually it's something which is probably a characteristic across most people. So something which I think we kind of came to the conclusion when we were writing about this is that actually some of the issue isn't that it's necessarily that, conservation practitioners aren't reflexive, it's that actually it can be really challenging to translate that thinking into action. So you might have conversations down at the bar after a day of work, and you might be talking about these things and think about these things, but then there simply isn't the space to then go back to work and actually say, okay, this is how we're going to do things differently. And I think in our paper we kind of shied away from calling for more reflexivity and towards thinking about, okay, what are the things that can be done to kind of ease that transition from kind of thinking into subsequent changes in actions and behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Tom, and I think Alejandra kind of alluded to it in terms of the informal and formal spaces of reflexivity, and that being the informal being quite invisible in many ways. And I think that is a challenge and something hopefully everyone has some ideas about. And I think, if there's nothing directly to be said to there, Anna, please go ahead. You've had your hand up for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you all. So I just want to, can you hear me? No.
When you're a bit closer to the speaker, it's really clear. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll speak like this. Okay, I put this question to discuss because I have my own experience of working as anthropologist in trying to implement ethnography into the conservation projects and trying to, teach conservation practitioners ethnography and reflexivity. And it has been quite challenging initiative for me. In my case, there was like not much of this, what you, Tom, said, that they had like kind of this self-reflexivity training, or they didn't have even kind of awareness why they actually would need social research to do conservation. So it's like very different case than your case. So I also wanted to kind of I also started to think how do I teach ethnography in such a landscape, and then how do I talk about the self-reflexivity in such cases as well. So that's why I was so interested in gathering your own experiences of doing so. And another thing is that I realized while doing this is that across the organization that I was working with, sometimes the question is also not about people not being reflexive, but the power that they have to actually vocalize this reflexivity. So in many cases, like field staff, like very low in the structure of organization, was pretty reflexive about the, for instance, limits of their interventions, but this knowledge could never reach the management, or not talking even about the donors who have their own perceptions of what should be, you know, done, or how the intervention should look like. So that was also like kind of very interesting, how across this one body, like say NGO, there are this different positionalities of people there, and how reflexionality is often not being empowered within the organization. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Anna. And yeah, I mean, I think some of these issues, especially maybe just talking about maybe a donor example I have, which actually the political ecology group from Sheffield, where Judith is from, told me about, was the Ford Foundation. Work in Indonesia. They used to employ mostly kind of, say, Yale graduates there from the School of Forestry, and send them to do kind of social research in Indonesia. And through kind of a process of reflection, almost from the donor perspective, they kind of started to change that model because of realizing the results they thought they were going to achieve weren't happening, and they started to move the goalposts of what doing conservation in Indonesia meant, and then they started to hire kind of local staff more. And I think now over 50% of their funding is going to indigenous led conservation, which was only 10% kind of before. And so it's really interesting when you start to think about how donors can reflect, and they are also conservationists themselves. And yeah, I just wonder, yeah, is your experience from Indonesia as well, and it just shows how wide these groups are and how little sometimes they may talk to each other. But I think we can go to Benedict. You have your hand raised, and
thanks, Omar, because I think this is a really interesting thread that come up there with both Tom and Anna's points, because I think that, you know, like Tom's point that in essence, you know, reflexivity is actually something that humans do as social creatures is an important thing, but then it's somehow something that then one doesn't do in certain roles. And I sort of think that, well, that there's a really interesting question about then, like in conservation practice, well, where should reflexivity come in? Where would it be most desirable? Because clearly everybody is capable of it on some level. And I was thinking about then, I was sort of reminded of an experience I had at the European Cetacean Society, where we were in a workshop trying to draft ethical guidelines. And I was agitating quite strongly to sort of make some sort of statement that marine mammal scientists have some sort of ethical obligation to the community that they are working in or something. And this was something that was very difficult to sort of convince people of, actually, because they didn't see their work in those terms. They didn't see their role in terms of being part of a wider community. They saw themselves in their capacity as like being an expert on the whale. They might see themselves as having ethical obligations to what they consider to be their research object, say a whale or something, and also saw a very strong part of their identity as often a desire to protect those animals on some level. But they didn't see this connection to sort of the wider society that their research practice was taking place in. And so I think that, well, the way that one should, it needs to be sort of mainstreamed on some level. There needs to be institutions like scientific societies talking about these things. I think that's the way these things will sort of change, because at the moment the power of being a biologist, at least in my experience, to a certain extent revolves around sort of being having this fairly old-fashioned, perhaps. Maybe your other people here have different images, but the idea of a scientific expert on a subject, sort of dispassionate, separate, talking about objective reality, that sort of thing. And so I wonder whether, if somehow disseminating a wider, more social scientific notion of the context within which research is and what being an expert is might be useful to then get people to be more public in their reflexivity, because I'm sure most biologists you meet can then, the stuff that they talk to you off the record versus in the papers is different.
Thanks for that, Benedict. I think that's a great example, and the term mainstreaming reflexivity. A recent paper came out about institutionalizing reflexivity as well, and how exactly that can be done, and maybe reflexivity officers are needed within an organization, and some conservation NGOs are starting to kind of incorporate it in this very adaptive management type of sense, and it's something Tom et al. Kind of found in examples in our paper. And I think, Alejandra, you've probably definitely got a lot to say on this topic, and bridging these issues of reflexivity between different spaces, and how we do it, because we all can in some ways, and what the limits are. Like you were saying, Benedict, at the beginning, when do we not reflect as well? It's important to think about. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, as we were saying about donors, so a lot of my work was in monitoring and evaluation. So, donors ask you to write a monitoring report, and you just say if you've been meeting your objectives, and it's kind of a checklist thing. But it's moving on to kind of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And donors are kind of pushing that a bit more, pushing the learning bit. How are we learning from our past experiences and doing a bit more of an adaptive management thing? But it doesn't come from all donors, and it doesn't happen in all teams. And I think that the process of monitoring and kind of like checking boxes and deciding when we meet objectives is quite interesting within conservation. And I think that it's also one of the constraints within conservation. But I find it really interesting how there is, I think that both from donors and conservation organizations, especially if they are quite focused on the animals or the ecosystems themselves, and not on how people are interacting with these animals and with these ecosystems. I think there is quite a big challenge. So, for example, in my research for the illegal wildlife trade, you have two groups of people working in it. You have either biologists or vets, or lawyers. As a crime, and for crimes, you just have lawyers, right? And people say, it's a crime, it's illegal, therefore it shouldn't be done. But the morality of the law, like people assume that the law is moral, and therefore there is no reflexivity about it. You just say it's legal, therefore we should stop it. And there's no question about why people do the things they do, or how, or like the whole question of criminality and how something becomes crime, right? But I think that also comes with the terms that we use and the ways that we engage with the topics. I know for a fact that some projects, especially the ones funded by certain donors, have as indicators for monitoring the amount of people arrested with project, which to me it seemed like a great indicator of success. But for some donors, that is good, I guess. It's good to arrest more people. But then again, there's this whole process of monitoring and checking boxes, and how this kind of like binary, very simplistic ways of understanding limit how we can be reflexive in the process.
Thanks, Alejandra. Yeah, I feel this discussion is just getting started now. and it feels like we're going to start to have to wrap up. But I think that's what we have the live discussion for as well, partly in next week. And please, like the online chat platform and other ways to connect. But I think, please, any comments, anything anyone wants to add or say or reply to, the point about critical reflexivity versus reflexivity is key, and I mean there's so many issues to unpack there. Benedict, is that a residual hand or is it a new hand?
No, these are my residual hands. No, well, no, my thing was just to hop on a bit because I think, yeah, I agree. We're getting to this interesting, this distinction between critical reflexivity and reflexivity, because yeah, that was one of the things that I was slightly intrigued by in Sam's initial presentation, because the definition that was applied there was that reflexivity is an anti-colonial stance, whereas I don't. That's not how I would see it myself. I think that it can be used for such ends, obviously, like any tool. But it seemed to me to be somewhat inaccurate. I mean, surely the biggest imperialist ever could be reflexive over it. And this is one of the things that I think perhaps is something isn't reflected enough a bit on in at least the social studies of conservation, because I think that there are times when, from particular normative ethical standpoints, conservationists want to be imperialistic or colonist. And reflexivity would be to acknowledge that and then decide that one's ethical perspective is that, I'm sorry, I think in this case the elephants are more important than the local people in this particular regard. It's not a perspective I personally endorse, but I think there is an ethical standpoint that can have that. And I would say that would be the importance of reflexivity there, is that if you're going to be imperialistic or neo-colonial or whatever the word is, you shouldn't do it unconsciously. And that seems to be a lot of the problems that emerge in the literature, is that it's almost as if conservationists, as the good guys, haven't been able to reflect that it's actually much more complex, the result, than that. And I also think that if you it's something you need to be honest about with yourself. In the article I provide, and I think in the example I give in the presentation, where I discover that one of my key informants who is working in integration and migration is actually a racist or an anti-Muslim. I'm not willing to take his perspective, and that's a lot about me rather than him. I cannot, though, take the ultimate sort of step of seeing the world or accepting the world on his terms, and that's a weakness, I think, in my ethnography to an extent. I'll never be able to really give a positive interpretation of his worldview, for example. And that's what reflexivity is about as well, is that, well, actually, I don't think it's right that I should try and take that point of view. I'm talking too much, apologies.
No, I mean, that's great, Benedict. And I think that idea of assuming the marginalized actors are always going to have egalitarian views is something to really think about. And as well, more reflexivity isn't necessarily good, like Tom has also kind of just put in the chat, and it can really reinforce our assumptions sometimes in some case. And I think then the interesting idea is that reflexivity or not? And I think we go back into the definitions of what reflexivity is there. Again, I think goal-orientated actions is something maybe that defines critical reflexivity to some extent, but I think that can also be negotiated and discussed further as well. I don't know how much time we have, Sam, but maybe you can wrap up a bit if you want, and we can take it from there. Are there any last comments at all? I mean, hopefully you can keep this discussion going throughout the week if possible.
Alejandra, you have your hand up. Do you want to say something to finish from before? Okay, a residual hand. Well, no, I mean, I guess just thank you all. I think we were encouraged by Pollen to keep the live discussions relatively short, so that the content is kind of online and accessible to people sort of around the globe at different times, and will kind of be there and people can engage with it as they will. So yeah, sorry to not kind of take this on longer, but it is really great. And thanks, Omar, for facilitating that, because it's really nice to kind of hear everyone's perspectives and to see lots of things going on in the chat. Yeah, I think, you know, this is just like a small discussion in amongst lots of things that are going on in this area. So it's really nice to kind of bring them together. There were also, we had 8 originally talks for the session, had we been doing it in a slightly different format. So there's obviously a much bigger interest in this as well as the work that you're all doing and that you've mentioned in the chat and everything. So I guess, yeah, there's not necessarily very much to, or not really a way to kind of sum up in a sense, because it's such a big kind of topic. I guess just one thing personally for me, I think this critical reflexivity, and I talk about it a bit in that chapter that I've just put on in the chat there, just in case anyone's interested. I think to me, critical social sciences are about supporting the people that are most oppressed and working towards tackling injustices. So for me, that critical reflexivity is an extension of that. So that's where it's not just reflexivity for the sake of reflexivity, it's reflexivity for the sake of that initial kind of definition about kind of working to tackle sort of overt and subvert, overt oppressions and others as well. But yeah, really good chat. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Alejandra and Benedict and Cyan in particular for your presentations. And yeah, if you've not had a chance yet to watch them, you know, do go over onto the web pages and watch them. Thanks for joining us from the Amazon and from India, where Diwali is taking place right now. So we'll let you get back to that. And Anand coming from Nepal, where Tihar is going on. So yeah, thank you all for kind of joining us from many different places. It's been great to hear from you. And yeah, if you want to join us for the final chat of the discussion of the workshop, we're going to try and bring together the different sessions. So we might continue some of the chat here, but also from the other sessions that are going on as well. So that's it. I think we should probably finish it there. But thanks very much. And sorry about the Zoom bombing earlier. That's rubbish. But thank you for staying with us.
Thank you very much.
Take care.